You have driven the ridgelines of central Appalachia before, even if you have never once gotten out of the car to look closer. The road climbs through a tunnel of hardwood, switches back along a shoulder of exposed rock, and for a moment the whole valley opens up below you, ridge after ridge folding into BLU haze all the way to the horizon. It is the kind of view that makes people pull over just to stand there for a minute, hands on a guardrail, looking at country that seems to run on a time scale older and slower than anything happening in the valley towns below it. That impression is not wrong, exactly, but it is incomplete. The mountains people picture as unchanging, folded into the same shapes for millions of years, are in fact home to living systems that shift constantly along smaller, quieter timelines measured in single degrees of average temperature or a few hundred feet of elevation, changes too gradual for a passing driver to notice, but plenty large enough to matter to something that spends its entire life within a narrow band of that mountainside. It is also, increasingly, the kind of view where wildlife officials across West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, and Western Virginia are documenting something they did not expect to find quite this high up, quite this far along the spine of the mountains, and quite this often. The timber rattlesnake has always belonged to Appalachia in the way certain animals belong to certain landscapes, inseparable from the identity of the place, even for people who have never seen one. Older generations along these ridges grew up with stories about den sites their grandparents knew and avoided, rocky south-facing outcrops where the snakes gathered each fall to overwinter together in the same crevices their ancestors had used for longer than anyone could say. For most of the last century, though, that relationship was one of retreat rather than expansion. Habitat loss, road mortality, and decades of organized rattlesnake hunts and bounty programs pushed populations down across much of the species' historic range, to the point that timber rattlesnakes now carry some form of protected or special concern status in a majority of the states where they still occur. Roundups that once drew crowds to county fairgrounds each spring, where hunters were paid by the pound for animals pulled directly out of den sites during the vulnerable weeks when the snakes were still sluggish from winter, took a toll that population models suggest the species is still recovering from in some parts of its range. Field researchers who cut their teeth cataloging dens decades ago often describe watching known sites go quiet over the course of their careers, entire denning populations reduced to a handful of animals or eliminated outright, and the assumption that took hold during those years was straightforward. The mountain's rattlesnake population was shrinking, retreating toward its most secure, most remote strongholds, and the best anyone could hope to do was slow that retreat down. The story wildlife biologists expected to keep telling about this snake was one of slow, managed decline. That is not entirely the story anymore, and the shift is showing up in a specific, measurable way that has caught researchers off guard. Wildlife biologists tracking den sites along the higher ridgelines of the central Appalachians have started documenting timber rattlesnakes using elevations and denning locations well above what most range surveys from a generation ago would have predicted. Populations that were assumed to be confined to lower and mid-elevation slopes are turning up on exposed rock faces near ridged crests, in terrain that field guides from decades past would have flagged as too cold, too exposed, and too short on growing season for a species that depends on being able to bask long enough each year to complete gestation and successfully overwinter. Hikers on some of the most heavily used long-distance trail corridors in the region are reporting more frequent encounters at elevations where local trail clubs say sightings used to be a rare, notable event rather than a seasonal expectation. Trail maintenance crews doing routine work on switchbacks and overlooks near ridge crests have started logging encounters in maintenance notes as a matter of course, something that would have warranted a special report a generation ago and now barely rates a mention beyond the log itself. One long-serving den site researcher who has surveyed the same stretch of central Appalachian ridgeline for the better part of 3 decades has described the shift to colleagues in direct terms, saying that sites he mapped early in his career as marginal, occasionally used overwintering spots at the upper edge of viable habitat are now showing consistent, repeated use year over year, evidence of exactly the kind of established residency that a temporary or wandering individual snake would not produce. None of this reads, on its own, like an emergency. It reads like a pattern nobody planned for, moving in a direction nobody entirely agreed to call good news or bad news yet. Ask why it is happening, and you will find free explanations circulating among the people who study these mountains closely, and none of them agree with each other about what is actually driving the animal upward. The first explanation is the one that fits most comfortably with a species climate researchers have been watching for years. Timber rattlesnakes, like all snakes, depend entirely on ambient temperature to regulate their body function, and high elevation ridgelines have historically been too cold for long enough stretches of the year to support a viable population, particularly during the vulnerable months of gestation and overwintering. Regional climate data for the Central Appalachian Ridge and Valley Province shows a real, measurable increase in the number of frost-free days at higher elevations over the past several decades, along with warmer average temperatures during the exact denning season when a rattlesnake's survival depends most on shelter from hard freezes. Under this theory, the ridge crests were never permanently off-limits to the species, so much as temporarily too cold, and as the historic thermal ceiling has lifted, the snake has simply followed it upward, a slow migration measured in elevation rather than latitude, but built on the same underlying mechanism driving range shifts researchers have documented in reptile populations elsewhere in the country. Supporters of this explanation point out that the newly documented high-elevation dens tend to sit on south and southwest-facing rock, the exact orientation that would benefit most from even a modest increase in average seasonal warmth, rather than being scattered evenly across ridgelines regardless of sun exposure, which is closer to what you would expect if elevation itself were the primary driver, rather than a secondary detail. The second explanation credits something considerably more deliberate than climate, and it comes from the people who spent careers trying to reverse the population decline in the first place. Conservation protections enacted across much of the timber rattlesnakes range over the past several decades, ending organized bounty hunts and restricting commercial collection, were designed with exactly this kind of long-term recovery in mind, even if nobody expected results to show up as a vertical shift along the ridgeline rather than a simple increase in population density at existing sites. Under this theory, what looks like an expansion into new territory is in fact a population finally growing large enough after generations of suppressed numbers that younger snakes are being pushed by ordinary competition for den sites and territory into marginal, higher elevation habitat that the historic, larger population would have occupied as a matter of course before hunting pressure ever thinned it out. The snake is not discovering new ground. It is reclaiming ground the species held before people started actively working against it, and the protections finally had enough time to work. Wildlife managers who favor this explanation tend to point to the timeline itself as the strongest piece of supporting evidence, noting that the current wave of high elevation reports began showing up roughly the length of a full generation of rattlesnakes after the last of the organized bounty programs in the region were phased out, which lines up with how long population recovery models predict it would take a suppressed population to rebuild enough density to start pushing younger animals into marginal habitat again. The third explanation is the most mundane of the three, and also the hardest for wildlife officials to rule out entirely, because it has less to do with the snake and more to do with who is watching for it. Recreational hiking and backcountry camping along the Central Appalachian trail corridors has grown enormously over the past couple of decades, driven by a combination of long-distance thru-hiking's rise in popularity and a broader post-pandemic surge in outdoor recreation that shows no sign of fully reversing. A ridge crest that used to see a handful of hikers a season, none of them necessarily trained to identify or report a rattlesnake encounter accurately, now sees a steady stream of foot traffic, much of it documented in real time through trail journals, hiking forums, and social media posts specifically because thru-hikers have built an entire culture around chronicling every notable encounter along the trail. Under this theory, the snake was very possibly always up there in small, scattered numbers too sparse and too rarely observed to register as a pattern, and what has actually changed is the volume and documentation habits of the humans now walking through its territory often enough to notice. Trail culture along the region's most popular long-distance corridors has shifted meaningfully over the past couple of decades, moving from a pastime documented mostly in personal journals toward one chronicled almost in real time, with individual encounters routinely photographed, geotagged, and shared to hiking communities within hours of happening, creating a volume and permanence of documentation that simply did not exist when the last generation of researchers first mapped the species' known range. Biologists working directly with the den site data tend to resist collapsing this into a single tidy answer, and the reason is that each theory explains part of the picture without cleanly accounting for all of it. The climate data is real and does correlate with the timing of the higher elevation reports, which argues against pure observation bias. But the specific ridge segments producing the most new den site documentation do not always track the segments with the most measurable warming, which complicates a purely climate-driven explanation. Population recovery from the end of bounty hunting fits the timeline reasonably well in some areas, but researchers monitoring genetic diversity at several of the newer high-elevation den sites have found signatures that suggest at least some of these populations are not simply overflow from older, larger, lower elevation dens, but have been established at altitude for longer than a recent recovery. Story alone would explain. And the recreation and reporting theory, while clearly contributing to how much data now exists, cannot account for pH-Weisical evidence like shed skins and confirmed den sites in locations that predate the recent boom in trail traffic. What the data does support, more confidently than any single explanation, is that the old assumption about where the species stops, the elevation line past which a timber rattlesnake simply should not be able to survive the year, no longer holds as firmly as it once did across a meaningful stretch of the central Appalachian ridge system. Whether that line moved because the mountains warmed, because the population finally recovered enough to reclaim it, or because people only recently started walking high enough and often enough to notice a pattern that was already there, the practical reality for anyone spending real time on these ridgelines is the same. The comfortable zone people once associated with high, exposed rock, the assumption that elevation itself offered a kind of natural safety, does not describe the mountain as reliably as it used to. People who have spent their lives in these hollows and along these ridgelines tend not to describe this shift with alarm, and that mastered reaction says something important about how the region actually relates to an animal it has coexisted with for generations. Longtime residents talk about den sites the way they talk about weather patterns or hunting seasons, as local knowledge to be updated and passed down rather than a threat to be eliminated. Trail maintainers and backcountry rangers mention elevated encounter rates in the same practical tone they use to discuss trail erosion or water source reliability, one more variable in a landscape that has always required a working knowledge of its hazards. Nobody is closing trails. Nobody is calling for a return to the bounty programs the last generation spent decades dismantling. The mountain has simply, quietly, started asking people to update where they think the line sits, in the same way their parents and grandparents once learned exactly which rocky outcrop deserved a wide path in October. What remains genuinely unresolved, and may stay that way for years, is which force is doing the most work in pushing that line upward, and whether the three explanations are actually competing at all, or simply describing overlapping pressures on the same slow, patient animal. A warming ridgeline may be opening territory that was closed for longer than anyone living can remember. A recovering population may be filling in territory it never truly gave up. And a growing wave of hikers, cataloging every rock outcrop and den site along the way, may simply be the first generation in a long time paying close enough attention to notice that the mountain never stopped changing beneath their boots. Nobody currently studying the ridgelines of central Appalachia is willing to say definitively which explanation carries the most weight, only that the elevation the species is willing to call home has already moved further than the old maps predicted, and that whatever is drawing it upward has given no indication of stopping to explain itself. There is a specific kind of guet that settles over these mountains once you know this, different from the quiet people usually describe when they talk about Appalachia's remoteness. It is not the silence of an empty landscape. It is the silence of a landscape that is doing something it has always done, adjusting itself in small, patient increments long before anyone walking through it notices. And that has simply, for a stretch of years, been doing it somewhere a little higher than the maps accounted for. Longtime residents of these ridges are not, by and large, unsettled by that idea the way an outsider might expect. People who have spent generations reading this terrain tend to understand instinctively that a mountain range old enough to have watched entire mountain chains rise and erode elsewhere on the continent was never going to hold perfectly still, just because a field guide printed a boundary line on a map. What has changed is not the mountain's willingness to shift. What has changed is that, for the first time in a long while, enough people are paying close enough attention, walking high enough, and watching carefully enough to notice exactly where that shift is currently happening, and to admit, honestly, that nobody yet knows how far it intends to go. If you found this fascinating, hit subscribe for more stories like this.